All right, we are continuing our study on parenting. I appreciate Ricky Bruce taking the class last week and dealing with discipline, the second part of that study, as we split lesson 6 or the material on discipline. And I appreciate the excellent job that he did last time. Today we're on page 41 of the workbook. We're talking about the challenges for parents with small children during worship services. It's kind of a long title, but nonetheless, that is a challenge. And we're going to try to work through those and hopefully provide some helpful information, add to the material that is in the workbook. And so we'll make our way there in just a moment. We're ready for lesson 7 of the workbook. This is lesson 9 of the total series, but lesson 7 in the workbook, page 41, if you're following along. We try to each week give a parenting rule, which is simply application. Most of the rules are not quotations from Scripture, but application of the principle of training a child in the way that he should go. So in harmony with the lesson that we have today on children's behavior in worship, the basic rule is that when parents have control of children in their homes, it is much easier to make them behave in worship. Would you agree with that? Yes. Now, why is that true? All right, the rules are already set and the foundation is already laid. That's very good. What we see here in that rule is that control and discipline at home have a direct relation to control and behavior during worship. Now, there may be exceptions to that, but generally that's true. That you show me, if I could go into someone's home, and I've never seen them at worship, but if I could go into their home and watch them, and the children are well behaved, they have them under control, the children are respectful, I can just imagine that when we get to worship services, those children are going to be controlled and behave. I go to a worship service and I meet a couple that I've never seen before, and you see that their children are unruly and they continue to be unruly and disruptive. Most likely, if I were to go in their home, I'm going to see the same thing. Would you agree? Now, there are exceptions, I recognize, and there may be moments where a child is having a problem that normally doesn't have a problem. I'm not talking about those, we're talking about general rules. So when we get control of the child as per the discipline of lesson 6, those 2 lessons, if those are implemented, then this section becomes much easier. Make sense? All right. Let's look at some introductory things on page 41 now, if you're following along, and we'll add some information, but if you care to follow along, make notations or underline some of what the author has said. You may find it helpful. Our author makes the point that many parents neglect spiritual training in the formative years, and they often use their children as an excuse for not coming to services. They themselves may not come but once a week, and maybe not every week, and when asked, well, the children are so disruptive and they don't behave and they don't know how to behave at services, and the children become an excuse, and consequently they don't bring them to services. And the author makes this point 1b here, that if we neglect training for worship, what motivation will they have for worship later in life? And that is, if we're not teaching the children that worship is important, then as they grow up, they'll not have any use for worship at all. I'm reminded of a place where Joan and I went for a meeting back in the 80s, and it was a small group. The last night of the meeting, we had a total of 25, and stood people up around the auditorium. So that tells you how small the building was. But nonetheless, the members there would bring their children on Sunday morning, but through the rest of the week, they would get a babysitter. And that was pretty much the custom for this congregation. They'd get babysitters for their kids so they could pay attention. And I often wondered, reckon how those children turned out. Because they weren't taught the importance of worship. This is not for you, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Well, on the other end of the spectrum, some will bring their children to every service, and yet the children are not taught to behave. They're not taught about paying attention and being reverent and respectful and being quiet. And we're going to talk about that as the lesson unfolds. So here are the four things our author has laid out, and we're going to try to cover all four of these because all four sections I think are important. So let's start with this on page 41, and that is worshiping God must be taught to our children. We're in the first column, the bottom of that column, worshiping God must be taught to our children. Let's start with this. It is imperative that our children be taught the importance of assembling for worship. Our other author cites John 4:24, which says, all right, those who worship God must worship Him in spirit and truth. God is a spirit, and those who worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. And so here is the importance of worshiping God. Let's add a couple of passages to that. You heard Hebrews 10:25 quoted multiple times, but I want you to see, as we've often made the point, that not forsaking the assembling of yourselves together, as the manner of some is, that phrase, I think, is one of the more important phrases in its historical and textual context, which means the assembling for worship was not to be forsaken even under distress, under threat, under persecution. That tells me of the vital importance of worship. Very, very important. That even when you're threatened, you may be beaten if you go to worship, go anyway. Your house may be ransacked if you go to church today. Your tent may be destroyed if you go to services today. Go anyway. Now, children need to be taught the importance of that. This is a period of worship and praise of the Almighty God, so children need to be taught. What we're doing here is we're praising the God you've been studying about in Bible class. And particularly at the earliest of ages, they may not be learning anything much, but this is a Bible, and we worship God. God created the world, but they need to be reminded this is the Almighty God that we're worshiping. And furthermore, it's important because it's commanded. God told us to do this. We're going to church because God told us to, and we ought to obey God. Does that make sense? We're trying to emphasize the importance of worship. Now, that can present difficulties when the children are real young. How so? Well, babies need attention. That's when they're real young. Babies got to have attention. Maybe those babies and children as they get a little bit smaller are going to be tired at times. They're going to get fussy. The child that's great today and behaves may not behave at the next service. The child that's not tired today may be tired tonight, or next Sunday may be just extremely tired for whatever purpose. There's going to be misbehavior. They're going to cry. And we're going to have those difficulties and those problems. There's going to be times that it's hard to focus in worship while seeing to small children. If you don't have children yet, you may not understand that, but if you sit around some mother that's dealing with her child, just pay attention. It may be hard for her to focus during worship because of these small children. And so if you've had children, reflect back that you'll remember a time, or if you've got grandchildren now, you may have to see to them once in a while and you'll be reminded it's kind of hard to focus at times and pay attention to the song and the sermon and the prayer and the Lord's Supper when you're seeing to a crying child. And so all we're trying to present is there's some difficulties that come about. Now, here's some material I want to add to this. Our author makes this point about the concept of special. Let's add some information here that's not in the workbook. Small children need to know that this is a special time. This is special. I emphasize the word special, and so does our author. The child can be taught and trained by preparation that the family makes. Would you agree with that? Even at the earliest of ages, the child can begin to take notice. Even dogs, if you have a dog in the house, will probably take notice that Sunday is different from the other days of the week. We had a dog that was in the house years ago when our kids were small, that every morning when we would go to school, the dog got to go, and so the dog stood at the door begging to go. But when the dog saw us putting on church clothes, the dog would go to its cage or to its pen or the room we had designated for him to stay. Because realize this is a different day. See, it doesn't take a 2-year-old can recognize that there's something different about this day. The preparation that's being made. That we plan and we schedule to be at every service. And the lessons are prepared. The lesson for the young child may not be nothing but memorizing a little short verse or going back over the lesson and rehearsing that God created the world. Here's what he did on the first day. But we're getting our lesson for Bible class. And we're going to do it again next week and next week and next week. And that clothes are cleaned and ready. That emphasizes the importance. Now, let's make a parallel. Suppose your child is in sports and comes day for their playing their game, and it's time to leave, and the clothes that they wore last game still have stains on them, and they're in the dirty clothes, and nobody thought to get them ready and get them clean. What does that tell the child about your attitude toward the sport? We really don't care. It's not important. Because if it's important, we're going to let's make sure that the clothes are, the uniform's clean and it's ready, and you can get dressed and you can be there on time. And sometimes we're that way with church. Here's the second thing. Yes. Yes, you're exactly right. Absolutely. That's a good point. Tells you what you think of the child. Secondly, we can teach and train our children that this is a special time by being on time for class and worship. Why is that important? All right. Very good. Shows respect. What? All right, very good. Let's go back to the ball game. Your child plays sports. And what if every game they played, you were getting there just as the first inning is starting, if it was baseball, just as they're throwing out the first pitch, you show up with your child. What does that tell your child? They won't be on the team very long. Why? It's not important to the child. Or maybe it was important to the child, but the parent's not making sure they're there. That's not important to the parent. You want them to excel in sports, but you've got them there late for every time. Every time we start, come in just a little bit late.
The game doesn't begin when they get out on the field. There's practice before, there's interaction before, there's team building before, and all of that happens also in other places and other events.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, we're trying to teach them this is special. We can teach them that worship is important to them and not just class. What would we mean by that? Do you think maybe that we sometimes emphasize Bible classes for you? Let's take you to Bible class. Let's get you ready for Bible class. And we may not say it, but we leave the impression that worship service is not for you at 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6, 7 years old, but that's for us adults. You think we ever do that? Is that a good thing? No, it's a big mistake, big mistake. We need to remind them this is for them. We'll say more about that a little bit later as we go further. Here's another principle of teaching them it's special. It can be taught by the serious plans for worship when you travel. In other words, we're going to go on vacation and we happen to be at a place where there's not a church, but we didn't really know that till we got here. What does that just teach the child? We didn't make plans for God. Or we're not willing to drive maybe an hour that Sunday morning and Sunday night to be at a place where we can worship with the saints. Because that's too much trouble, we're telling the child, worship is not all that special. But when we make plans and we say, no, we're not going to go to this place because it'll be too far from a church. We want to be where there is a church where we can worship God. We're making plans for worship. We can teach them that it's special when it's not treated as casual. How do we treat worship as casual? Oh, yes, the way we dress, yeah. We dress for church like we're going to a ball game. All right. Sometimes the preparation before and the aftermath can be casual. Our attitude could be casual. We go if it's convenient. We don't go if it's not convenient. That's just kind of a casual.
Young children
Very good. Very good. Respect for God. All right, so we need to teach them that worship is important. Those are the things we're driving at there. Let's go to page 42 now. If you're following in the workbook, let's talk about discipline during the worship service is needed. At the top of the page, our author makes this point that babies do something that all babies do, and that's cry. A couple of comments about that. One of which is, when you hear babies cry, that means that there's some dedicated parents that realize that worship is important for them and for their children, doesn't it? So you're sitting in worship and you hear a baby cry, that means that there's some parent back there that realizes being at church is important, and it's important to have my children here. Furthermore, it's better to have that problem with a lot of babies crying than a church that has no children at all. I've held meetings at places where you could hear a pin drop. If you heard anything, you might hear an old person snoring. But you don't hear a baby cry. And you won't hear a baby cry, and it won't be long till you won't hear anything at that church. Which tells me there's a future in that church if you hear some babies crying. So babies crying is not a bad thing. Now, consideration of other people means that the child may need to be taken out for a short time when babies cry. Now, I want to make it, this is not in the material in the workbook, but I want to make a plea for balance. A little balance would be helpful. Because when you're dealing with children, young children, and them crying, there's two extremes with reference to that, and so I'm making a plea for some balance here. On the one side, other people that are not dealing with that child, we need to be patient with the parent who's trying to deal with the crying child. Most mothers and some fathers will identify with this, that when your child is crying, you think everybody in the building is staring at you. And some of them will be. I can remember when our children were small that some of the older people whose children had been raised, I think, had forgotten what it was like to deal with a small child, would turn around and look and stare at you like, what are you doing and what are you going to do? Joan wouldn't let me do this, but I had enough guts about me. I wanted to pick the child up and take it and hand it to that person, and you deal with it. I would have done it, but it would have embarrassed Joan. I would have done that. Literally, I would have done that. But nonetheless, do what? Good thing. Probably wisdom sometimes needs to win out. But my point here is we need to be patient with that mother or that father dealing with that crying child. Now let's balance that on the other side. Parents need to be considerate of other worshipers who are hearing the continual crying that may be distracting. And so I go back to this point our author makes. Consideration for others means that your child may need to be taken out for a short time. Does that make sense? Be considerate of others, but let's also be patient. There needs to be some balance with reference to that. Now, there's a need for discipline during worship. We're still on page 42 if you're trying to follow along. About middle of the section, the first column, as we think about discipline, the paragraph starts. This is where we are. There's a need for instructive discipline. By instructive discipline, we may need to teach the child how to behave in worship. This is what is expected of you. This is what you're going to do during worship. That's discipline. We're just teaching and instructing. There is also corrective discipline, means that we may need to correct, we may need to punish. There are going to be some consequences for not following those rules of being quiet, behaving, not throwing a tantrum, etc. Make sense? Both are needed. Now, I'm not going to take the time to look at all the details. We're going to look at some of these. And the reason for that is these principles were covered in 2 lessons. And so Ricky dealt with some of those passages. I dealt with some of those same passages in the first part of lesson 6. And my point here is that the principles of discipline apply here. If not, why not? Does that make sense? Why? Proverbs 22:15. Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, which means children are going to misbehave. Your child, at some point, if it hasn't already, will misbehave in worship and embarrass you. Just mark it down. It's going to happen. They're going to do it. But discipline, instructive and corrective, is going to take care of that eventually. May not be the first time, may not be after the second time, may not be the third time, may not be, but it's going to help at some point. Make sense? So those principles of lesson 6 are going to come apply. Now let's talk about making use of the nursery. Our author calls it a cry room, and some abuse of that. A nursery is a place that is designed for a mother, a place where a mother can go nurse her child in privacy. That's needed. And so that's a place where she can do that. We happen to have 3 nurseries because of a number of children. And we won't go into all the details of that, but those who are here know the use for those. It's a place where the mother and the father both could go in one of the nurseries and change a diaper. So it's a place where they can take care of those needs. It's a place where you may take the child to calm a crying child down. Or it's a place where you may take the child and discipline the child who needs correction for their misbehavior in worship. And sometimes when the child is going out, you know what's about to happen. And you think, yep, they needed that. But I want to suggest to you, it's not a playroom. Now, here's the abuse that sometimes is made of a nursery. The child is misbehaving. I'm embarrassed. So I take the child out and I come back in and the child's still misbehaving. So I take the child out, put them in the floor. They can play in the floor. They can do some things. And now they're having fun, but it's keeping that away from everybody else. So I'm keeping the distraction away from worship. I'm helping everybody. But what have I just taught the child? Yeah. You act up again, you get to go play in the floor back there. You get to take your toys and play in the floor. You can run around, do what you want. You don't have to stay in your seat because we're allowed to go play. You're making a mistake as a parent when you let your child play, and that becomes a fun room. And so when that child recognizes, when I misbehave, I go to this nursery, and it wasn't pleasant, they don't want to go to that nursery. Does that make sense? Those of us who ride horses that are barn sour, what do we do, Stephen? Let them go back to the barn.
Very unpleasant.
Make it unpleasant. You're going to run them. You're going to make it hard on them when they get there, so that when they come the next time want to run to the barn, they think this ain't so fun. Child needs to learn that's not fun going back there. It's not a place to play. Does that make sense? Yeah. Now, young parents, I want you to write down, get a place and write down these 3 rules. Here's 3 simple steps for correcting misbehavior in worship. Got your pen, pencil? 3 simple steps. Now, we're not talking about an infant, a baby a few weeks old that's crying. I'm not talking about that. We're talking about a child that knows their behavior was not correct, and you're trying to correct that. So we're painting with a broad brush, shooting with a broad spectrum here. Here's the 3 simple rules. The child is misbehaving, you take them out, you wear them out, and you bring them back in. Now, when they misbehave, after you get back in, what do? Go back to step 1. Take them out, you wear them out, and you bring them back in. Some parents will get very frustrated because this is the 4th trip we've made out today. But at some point, listen to me carefully, at some point, that gets better. Young parents, listen to me. Those of us who've been through that and those who have children now that have been through that and they're better, it gets better. Take them out, wear them out, bring them back in. Take them out, wear them out, bring them back in. That works. Agree? 3 simple rules. All right. Let's talk about some do's and don'ts now. I want to be careful about these do's and don'ts, and I was pushing to get to this because I don't want to leave some things hanging about these do's and don'ts on page 42. The list doesn't apply to all ages, first of all. So you read one of these rules and you say, well, my baby's just 6 weeks old, and I don't see that this applies. Probably doesn't. And somebody else says, well, I've got a child here that's 5 years old, and so this rule doesn't apply to them? Probably doesn't. Again, we're painting with a broad brush. Children are going to grow out from infancy, and as they get bigger, there's more do's and more don'ts that may not applied when they were 2 or when they were 1 or whatever the case. Some of the things that we're going to be talking about may no longer fit your child's age. Take them out and change their diaper. Well, okay, you're beyond that. Some things may not yet fit your child. You may have this little infant, and they're not of that age where you're taking them out and wearing them out and bringing them back in. Okay, that'll come. But here's the point I want you to see. These do's and don'ts are judgment calls, and people differ. So don't take these as hard, fast rules, and we're going to make some suggestions about that here in just a second. Let's start with some do's. We're on bottom of page 42 now is the first, and spills over onto page 43. Now, we've already talked about this, so I'm going to hit this one quickly. Show the children that worship is not only for adults, but it's something for them as well. Meaning by that, don't hush your child as they try to sing along with the singing. Let them sing. Now, if they become disruptive, that's another matter, but my point is, let them sing. It's not in tune, let them sing. This worship is for them too. Does that make sense? You want to encourage that. Secondly, follow along during the Bible reading or sermon with your child, meaning you may have to help a child that just beginning, can't find all the passages, find that passage. And you may not be able to find all of them, but help them find some passages, particularly in the Bible reading or maybe during a sermon. Number 3, take notes during the preaching or a sign attached to the children. Let me footnote right here. We have a handout where you can fill in the blanks. Started out as small children. More adults use it than children. But nonetheless, we started that years ago, probably 20 years ago. Get them that for them to fill out. But if we don't have a handout, you can assign your child, write down every verse that you hear today. Or if you know what the sermon's going to be about, write down how many times he mentions this term or this word or whatever. How many times was baptism mentioned? Or how many times was the Holy Spirit mentioned? And the child can listen and watch for that. But on this matter of taking notes, when a child thinks they have to copy down everything that's on the slide, they will get extremely frustrated with my slides. Teach your child to get the major points if they want to take notes. Teach them how to take notes. Teach them to get the major points without because children get so frustrated. You went past that slide and there were 50 words on that and they didn't get them all. No, they're not going to get them all. I wouldn't get them all. I don't expect you to get them all. Teach them how to get the major points. Does that make sense? To pay attention. Talk about the services with your family later. How does that work? Yeah. Talk about the whole service, about the meaning of a song, how encouraging that song was, the point of the song. Talk about the meaning of the Lord's Supper. Talk about the sermon, how that may fit us. That was what we were talking about the other day, and we talked about, and so you make the application to your children. See, that'll fit us as we go off to work and school tomorrow, about how we behave, etc. And so talk about some things to teach them this is for them. When we're praying, teach your child to be quiet, and this is what we're doing. We're talking to God right now, and this is what is expected of you. And then our author makes this point, be patient and consistent, and you will have success. You agree with that? That's not a guaranteed rule. That's like Proverbs 22:6, train a child and then he'll not depart. That's a general rule. That's not a guaranteed principle. It just simply says this is a general rule. Would you agree? All right. Let's move on and talk about the don'ts. This is where we get a little more sticky here. Let's talk about some of the don'ts. Our author makes some points here, and I'm going to, let's wait till we get to the end before you pass judgment. Did he overdo it? And so we'll talk about that in just a second. But I do want to add this point right here, that these are judgment calls. And everybody may have a different judgment. And I'm going to give you some examples of that as we go along. But here's one basic suggestion. Don't bring a bag of toys that will distract more than they help. I don't think that means don't ever bring a toy for a child or a book for a child. But the idea is don't bring more distractions so that the child is distracted and is distracting to others. Does that make sense? Especially a toy or something that makes noise, and so that the child becomes distracting. So teach them the importance and the reverence for worship. We'll come back to that. Don't bring lots of food and candy and snacks. I don't mean that here's a baby that needs something that you occupy them with some Cheerios or whatever the case may be. But the idea, I've literally seen this where they have candy bars, open them up, have canned Cokes and open them up. I was preaching in a place where adults, talking about being casual, were bringing in this was during a meeting where I was preaching, bringing in their Starbucks coffee and sitting there sipping their coffee while I'm preaching. That's gone on. Places where I preach. Very casual approach. But don't bring lots of food and candy and snacks that's going to be continually expected. Now here our author makes a point that is a good point, but I think he's a little arbitrary in nailing down an age. I think he mentioned age 3, I don't remember, I believe that's right. That do not encourage naps for children that are old enough to pay attention. He says stop it at age 3. Others say 5, and others say 6, and others may say 7. You draw the line where you think it's best, but the point is, I have known of children who were ready to be baptized, they thought. But I've had to remind them, now you become a Christian, you were asleep on the pew laying down this morning, and you think you're ready to be baptized tonight? I'm not sure you're ready for that. Does that make sense? You need to be sitting up paying attention if you're ready to obey the gospel. But draw the line with your family. You may say, well, I'm going to do it at age 3 or 4. Somebody else says, no, it's going to be at age 6. Somebody else says 7. Well, whatever. Draw the line that we're now at the point. You're not going to take a nap anymore. You're going to sit up and you're going to pay attention. You're going to take notes. You're going to listen. You're going to do something. Make sense? Draw the line somewhere with your child. Don't allow your children to do schoolwork. I've seen that where children have brought their schoolwork and they're catching up on their math or their English and getting ready for tomorrow. Or, some think it's better, let them get their Bible lesson for next week. That's when they're doing their Bible lesson. They're not paying attention to the worship. Here's another don't. Don't give up if your children are older than toddlers. What's our author mean by that? That's a good point. All right, that's true. I think our author had in mind that everybody here that I know of is starting with their child as a baby and bringing them on. Here's someone that their child is older than a toddler, and they realize, you know what, I hadn't taught them, I hadn't trained them, I hadn't taught them about worship, and they're misbehaving and they don't sit well in worship. The point is, don't give up. You can still teach that child about the importance of worship. They still can be taught. They still can be trained. Some things can be changed. Does that make sense? So don't give up just because your child happens to be beyond those toddler years. Now, here's what I wanted to drive at. These points are judgment calls. So you may look at that and say, well, I'm going to bring some books and some small toys, and I'll bring a little bit of food, and I'm going to let my child have a nap until the age X, Y, Z, whatever that may be. These are judgment calls. But here's some good advice. Seek the advice from those who've done well. That may be somebody in this congregation. It may be someone in another congregation. Pick out a couple. They may still have small children or older children, or their children may be grown now. But pick someone out that you think those people have done well in the rearing and the raising of their children, and those kids behaved well in worship, and go ask them for advice. What should be done? What advice do they have? You'll find that's some of the most helpful information you'll get. Does that make sense? Go talk to them and say, what did you do? How did you get them to behave? I notice your children sit still and they behave. What did you do? How can you help me so that my children will be like that? That'll be the most helpful information I think you can gain. Make sense? All right. Yes, ma'am.
One of the things that you keep using the word worship for assembly. Worship begins at home. It's what mom and dad do, and they do it daily with their kids and sit down with them and sing with them and pray with them and interact with them at home. And that flows assembled together. And it happens more naturally if it happens within the home first.
It does. It does. Very good. Let's go to page 43 now. At the bottom of page 43, you may already be there. Let's talk about some encouragement for frustrated parents. And parents can be and will be easily frustrated at times, so let's talk about that. Small children are going to be a challenge to the best of parents. And so if you are frustrated, don't begin to think, I must be a terrible parent because things seem not to be going real well. I'm frustrated, you say. Frustration comes to the best of parents. It can be frustrating as you deal with them in the class or in the worship. Some parents have wondered, and I've heard this wondering go out loud, what's the use of even coming? You may think I don't get anything out of worship. You may think the child will never behave. I'm just wondering if it's ever going to take hold. I take them out, I spank them, and I bring them back in, and it's so frustrating. And so some of you can identify with that because you have those frustrating days. So here's, as our author winds this up, we're now on the top of 44. And here's a list of some things that may be helpful to you as a young parent. Here's number one. The fact that you come week after week shows you're committed to faithfulness. That doesn't need to be ignored. You say, but I came and I'm frustrated. I'm frustrated. And I was embarrassed and da-da-da-da-da. Okay, but the fact that you come week after week and week after week and bring that child that at times may be fussy and crying shows your faithfulness. Here's the second thing. Your efforts and your struggle will not go unnoticed. By whom? First of all, God takes notice of that, and others are taking notice of that. There are other parents taking notice that you're trying to do what's right and you're struggling and you're trying to fight through this struggle. And those who are older can remember those days and they're taking notice of your diligence and your faithfulness and your struggle. Here's the third thing that'll help with that. You're sowing seeds that bear fruit. Our author mentions a couple of passages here. Matthew 18, 1 Corinthians 3, and 6. All three, in fact, he mentioned three verses. Matthew 13 and in verse 13, 8 and 13, 23. All three of those passages talk about seed being sown that bears fruit. And so you sow seed, and when you plant a garden, you sow seed and you don't have fruit right at the beginning. You may have to wait a little bit. And it didn't come as quickly as you thought, but then finally fruit begins to bear. That's the point here, is that you're sowing seed that may bear fruit down the line. So that spanking, you took them out, you wore them out, you brought them back in, and you said it didn't do any good because I had to do it again and had to do it again and had to do it a third time. You're sowing seed that's going to bear fruit. It's going to bear fruit. It will. Just be patient. It's going to take place. Regular attendance our author makes this point, number 4, makes things better instead of worse. How so? You bring the child and it's just frustrating. I mean, you feel like you're wore out when services are over. You've been wrestling with the baby, you've been wrestling with the child, and you go home and you're exhausted and you think, whew, I don't know. But you come back and you do it again. That's better than not doing it at all. Absolutely. Because if you don't bring that child, they'll never learn what's right. Would you agree with that? Yes. God's taking notice, others take notice, the child may not, but they eventually will. They'll take notice, and they'll recognize that. Now, the last point our author makes here is being a parent doesn't bring instant results and instant gratification. Would you agree with that? How many times have you told your child to do something and then you have to tell them again, and the next day it's like you're starting all over, it's like they didn't even know how to do that, and you think, will they ever learn? And then you discipline them for that, and you have to discipline them again, and then again, and again, and again, and you think, will they ever learn? And it finally takes hold. Being a parent doesn't bring instant results, doesn't bring instant satisfaction, but it eventually works if we do it right. Make sense? Never give up. Never give up. All right, we're going to stop at that right there. Challenges during worship. Next week we'll talk about raising teenagers, so we jump up a little bit in age.